There is a certain type of person who unsettles others without ever trying to. They don't rush to clarify. They don't defend their choices. They don't correct every misunderstanding. They let people think what they want. To most people, this behavior feels strange, even threatening. In a world where everyone is taught to justify, clarify, and explain, the refusal to do so feels like a violation of an unspoken rule. And yet, psychologically speaking, people who never explain themselves are often operating from a very different internal framework. The first thing to understand is that explaining is usually a response to fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being judged unfairly, fear of losing approval. Most explanations are not about truth, they're about control. When someone explains themselves, they're often trying to shape how they are perceived. They want to manage the narrative. People who don't explain themselves have usually let go of that need. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means they've accepted something many never do. You cannot control how others interpret you. Once this realization sinks in, explaining begins to feel unnecessary, even exhausting. Psychologically, these individuals tend to have a strong internal locus of evaluation. Their sense of right and wrong, success and failure, identity and worth comes from within, not from external feedback. They don't need constant confirmation that they're understood because their self-image is stable enough to withstand misunderstanding. This is deeply uncomfortable for people who rely on social validation. Most people unconsciously use explanation as a way to negotiate belonging. If you understand me, you won't reject me. If I explain myself clearly, you'll accept my intentions. But people who never explain themselves have already accepted the risk of being misunderstood. They have made peace with it. Another psychological trait common in these individuals is emotional self-regulation. They don't react immediately to tension. When confronted, accused, or questioned, they pause. Not because they're calculating, but because they don't feel an urgency to defend their ego. Urgency is often a sign of insecurity. When someone rushes to explain, it usually means the situation has triggered their identity. They feel attacked, so they respond defensively. The explanation becomes armor. But people who don't explain themselves often don't experience situations as personal attacks. They separate who they are from what others think. This creates emotional distance, and emotional distance creates calm. There's also a cognitive element at play. People who rarely explain themselves understand that words don't always bring clarity. In fact, explanations often create more confusion. The more you explain, the more details others can pick apart, reinterpret, or weaponize. Silence, on the other hand, leaves little to distort. This doesn't mean these individuals are secretive or dishonest. It means they're selective. They speak when speaking adds value, not when it simply relieves discomfort. This selectiveness is often mistaken for arrogance, but arrogance seeks superiority. Silence seeks peace. Another important aspect is boundaries. Explaining yourself is a form of access. It invites others into your inner reasoning. People who never explain themselves are very clear, consciously or not, about where that access ends. They understand that not everyone is entitled to their inner world. This boundary is unsettling to people who expect emotional transparency as a default. In many social settings, explaining yourself is treated as politeness, cooperation, or respect. Refusing to do so feels like withholding, but psychologically, withholding can be healthy when explanation becomes self-betrayal. Many people over-explain as a trauma response. They learned early on that being misunderstood led to punishment, rejection, or conflict. So they developed a habit of constant clarification. People who never explain themselves have often unlearned this habit. They no longer feel responsible for managing other people's emotions. There is also a time-based maturity that develops here. Younger minds often explain themselves because they are still forming identity. They're trying to find where they fit. Older or more psychologically seasoned individuals tend to explain less, not because they know less, but because they've learned what explanation does and doesn't change. Experience teaches them a hard truth. People don't misunderstand you because you didn't explain well. They misunderstand you because they see through their own filters. Once you understand this, the impulse to explain fades. People who never explain themselves are also often comfortable with delayed resolution. They don't need immediate agreement. They don't need instant clarity. They don't need to win the moment. They allow time to reveal truth. This patience is rare in a culture addicted to instant reactions. And patience looks like silence. From the outside, their behavior can appear cold, distant, or even intimidating. But internally, it's often rooted in emotional economy. They don't waste energy on battles that don't matter. They choose peace over performance. And that choice changes how others respond to them. Because when someone doesn't explain themselves, it forces others to sit with uncertainty. And most people hate uncertainty, which brings us to the deeper social impact of this trait and why it often creates quiet power. When someone refuses to explain themselves, the dynamic shifts. The person asking questions expects engagement, clarification, a justification. When that doesn't arrive, the mind scrambles to interpret the silence, and interpretation fills the vacuum. Psychologically, humans are meaning-making machines. When information is missing, the brain invents explanations, often based on insecurity. This is why silence can feel intimidating. The person who doesn't explain controls nothing explicitly, yet influences everything implicitly. Others project onto them confidence, indifference, depth, superiority, or judgment. The silent person hasn't claimed any of these traits, but silence allows them to be assigned. This projection creates power, not power through dominance, but power through ambiguity. Ambiguity forces attention. People who explain themselves remove ambiguity. They clarify intentions, soften edges, and guide interpretation. And this reduces anxiety, but also reduces intrigue. People who don't explain preserve ambiguity, and ambiguity keeps people mentally engaged. This is why silence often feels like strength, even when it's simply neutrality. Another critical psychological factor is self-trust. People who never explain themselves trust their own judgment deeply. They don't need consensus to validate their decisions. They don't require agreement to move forward. This self-trust is rare. Most people doubt themselves constantly, and explanation becomes a way to seek reassurance disguised as communication. Does this make sense? Do you understand why I did this? Was I wrong? When someone doesn't ask these questions, it unsettles those who do. Silence exposes dependency. There's also a moral courage involved. Not explaining yourself means accepting that some people will misunderstand you permanently. They may think you're wrong, cold, selfish, or arrogant, and you let them. This requires a strong sense of identity, one that isn't fragile, reactive, or approval hungry. People who never explain themselves are often misunderstood as unkind. But psychologically, they're often simply self-contained. They don't outsource their self-worth. They also tend to be highly observant. When you stop explaining yourself, you start seeing how often people don't actually listen. They just wait to respond. Silence reveals this quickly. It shows who is curious versus who is controlling, who wants understanding versus who wants compliance. This awareness reinforces the choice not to explain. Why offer explanations to people who aren't seeking understanding? Over time, silence becomes a filter. Only those who are patient, respectful, and emotionally grounded stay engaged. Everyone else reveals themselves through frustration. This is why silence often provokes manipulation attempts. When explanation doesn't come, some people escalate, questioning, accusing, pushing. They're trying to regain control. The person who remains silent without hostility removes the usual levers of influence. There's nothing to argue with, nothing to twist. And that restraint feels threatening to those who rely on emotional reactions. Importantly, People who never explain themselves are not emotionally closed. They simply choose when and with whom to open. They value depth over breadth. Their explanations, when given, and are deliberate, not reflexive. This makes their words carry more weight. In contrast, constant explanation devalues speech. When everything is explained, nothing feels important. Silence creates contrast. Another misunderstood aspect is compassion. Not explaining yourself can be an act of respect. It acknowledges that others are capable of forming their own conclusions, even if those conclusions differ from yours. It says, I trust you to think for yourself. This is far more respectful than forcing your narrative onto others. Ultimately, the psychology of people who never explain themselves comes down to one central truth. They don't need to be understood to be at peace. They don't confuse clarity with worth. They don't equate misunderstanding with failure. They don't chase validation disguised as communication. They let their actions speak. They let time reveal truth. They let silence do its work. And in a world that constantly demands explanations, that quiet refusal becomes a form of strength. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady, and deeply unsettling to those who haven't learned how to stand on their own.